Welcome to On the Moneyline, a podcast by MMA Play 365. I'm Newsom, and I'm here to break down UFC 315, which goes down this weekend. We're back in Canada, so I'm sure the Canadian MMA fans are absolutely stoked for this. It's a pay-per-view, we've got 2 title fights, but the negative side is, and I don't always like to be negative, I'm very rarely negative when it comes to events. Anybody that, follows myself, listens to the podcast every single week, I always try and make lemonade out of the lemon, but I feel like this doesn't feel like a pay-per-view. There's 11 fights. I know there's been a couple of cancellations, but there's 11 fights. And again, it just doesn't feel as stacked as what it should for a pay-per-view. And yeah, we've got the 2 title fights, and that definitely, is a cherry on top of a baked cake, I suppose. But it just, to me, it just doesn't feel, I don't feel the mass excitement regarding the fight card, and I'm sure some of the fights will be great, but for these pay-per-views, we want to be seeing name value, top to bottom, or as top to bottom as it absolutely gets, or even, just the main card. As long as the main card's got a ton of, fighters in the top 3 and 5 of the divisions, then that's great, but it just doesn't feel like this pay-per-view specifically is that stacked. Of course I'm going to tune in, of course I'm going to watch, and the likelihood is I'm going to enjoy the event. It's just, like I say, with a UFC pay-per-view, I think there's a level of expectation, and I'm just not overly sold on it. We've got one fighter halfway down the card that has got a fighter that's on a 3-fight losing streak versus a fighter that's on a 4-fight losing streak. So, again, it's just one of them where even that fight I'm sure is going to be a really good fight, but name value, strong records, fighters on surging win streaks, that's what we expect for a UFC pay-per-view, and I just don't feel it's quite hit that nail. But again, I feel from a fight perspective, physically just watching an MMA fight, fighter versus fighter, I think we do have some really good fights. It's just lacking name value is what I'm trying to get at. But we will get into it. We will break the fights down. We'll talk about it from a betting perspective, as we always do. But just before we get there, as always, if you do want to jump into the action this weekend, then make sure you do so at MMAplay365.com. We've got something for every type of gambler, whether you're a fun gambler, a long-term gambler, whether you're somebody that just wants to tail a professional handicapper, which of course is myself. Then of course we have all of those areas covered in our main subscription packages, and also included in our main subscription packages is our Base AI UFC prediction software, which gives you a percentage prediction for every possible outcome of every UFC fight, for every UFC event. We don't separate that from the handicapper side. So if you subscribe to MMA Play 365, you get both the AI and the handicapper betting advice, predictions and information all included in one place. And our prices are super affordable. Our ethos is we want you to make the money back that you spend with us as quickly as you possibly can, so you can start profiting on top of your bets. And the only way to do that is to make those prices affordable. If we were charging you $600-700 for a year, or if we were charging you a couple of $100s a month, then of course it would be very difficult for your average gambler to make that money back. So we make it nice and cheap, super affordable, so you can make that money back, start profiting on top of your bets, and that's all at MMAplay365.com. And that's the introduction out the way, that's the promotion out the way. Let's get breaking down some fights, and of course, as always, we start in that main event. We've got the welterweight championship on the line. We've got Belal Muhammad versus Della Maddalena, and I think from a striking perspective, this fight is going to be super interesting. And look, Belal Muhammad, he does take a lot of shit online, and I don't want to say I kind of get it, because I don't want any fighter at any level to be taking shit. If you're a legitimate fighter with a legitimate record and legitimate dreams of making it to the UFC, or if you're a fighter that's already in the UFC, I don't like those fighters taking shit. But the reason why Belal Muhammad, takes a lot of shit is because of the fighting style. Some don't see it as exciting. He goes to a lot of decisions. So, from that side, I feel like, improving from a finishing perspective could be something that Belal Muhammad looks to, to sort of develop on in the future. But again, I don't feel it's, even with saying that, I don't think it's a real development point. He's a fighter that's got a certain style, and it's clearly a winning style because he's a UFC champion, and you don't become a UFC champion unless you are legitimately one of the best fighters on planet Earth. So, I think Belal Muhammad fights in a certain way. And from a striking perspective, I think the fight's really interesting because I believe that Della Maddalena in a 5-round striking fight with Belal Muhammad beats him. I think Jack's boxing is super slick. He, mixes combinations into the body, to the head, and like I say, rips to the body so the hands come down, then goes to the head. A little bit like what John Lineker used to do, for those OG MMA fans that will remember John Lineker in the UFC. And Jack Della Maddalena is very, very slick with the boxing. Again, good volume, puts combinations together, and also on the feet is just super quick as well. And this is another thing. I think that Jack Della Maddalena is going to have a significant speed advantage from a strike and a movement perspective. So for me, Belal Muhammad's got to mix things up to make this much harder for Maddalena, because look, like I say, Maddalena's got slick boxing, good speed, and if Belal Muhammad doesn't fight his own fight, then he could see this title fight slip away from him. But the thing is with Belal Muhammad, you can always guarantee and always rely on that fight IQ, on the fact that he can follow a game plan. And you look at previous fights in the UFC, when he's fighting a fighter that's super dangerous with striking, with a couple of holes in the wrestling and grappling, he mixes in the takedowns, but he does it smart. So you look at like the Luque fight, like he remained somewhat competitive. Well, I say somewhat. No, he remained competitive on the feet striking. It's just striking with Luque was always going to give Luque his best opportunity to land something. But what he would do is sort of like 90 seconds before the round's over in a close round, you just hit a takedown and get 90 seconds of top control time. Bang, the round's his. So, that's the level of fight IQ that we've got with Belal Muhammad, and it's probably one of his strongest attributes. And the fact that Belal Muhammad is so well-rounded, so he's a very good striker, he's a very good wrestler, he's a very good grappler, he's good both offensively and defensively. So if he's fighting a wrestler, then he can defend takedowns and keep the fight on the feet. And you look at Gilbert Burns, the Gilbert Burns fight. Gilbert Burns would have wanted everything to get Belal Muhammad down on the mat so he can grapple with him. But Belal Muhammad stayed striking, kept the fight upright, defended when he needed to, and won the fight in the way that he's strongest. He's not one of these fighters that will go out and try and beat his opponent where they're good. Like, yeah, from a flair perspective, that's great when a fighter tries to do that, but Belal Muhammad just wants to win. He's a born winner, and he doesn't care if he takes the easy way, which, again, is something that every fighter should do. Take the easy way. Take that path to victory that's sort of advantageous for you, and that's how Belal Muhammad operates. So, for me in this fight, when I'm looking at Belal Muhammad and Jack Della Maddalena, I feel like obviously all fighters start standing, so there's going to be levels of striking here, but I think Belal Muhammad's just going to shoot takedowns at Maddalena, and Maddalena can defend takedowns. He is getting better defensively there. A few fights ago, that was his weakness. Like, you look at his fight back against Basil Hafez, like, Hafez came in on short notice. Nobody had really heard of him before the UFC, at least the casual fans, and he comes in there and almost beats Jack Della Maddalena. Some people, for me, I still think that's 50-50. I've watched that fight so many times since, and every single time I come with the same conclusion that it was as 50-50 as a fight gets. It could have gone either way. And Hafez hit 3 takedowns on Jack Della Maddalena, tied him out a little bit, and also had some top control time as well. But since then, I do think that Maddalena's worked on that defensive wrestling and grappling and got a little bit better. But now he's facing a fighter where, look, there's levels in MMA, and Belal Muhammad's level in regards to wrestling and grappling is much higher than that of Basil Hafez. So, I still feel that although Maddalena's worked on that side of his game, I still feel it's going to be a weakness for somebody like Belal Muhammad to take advantage of. And I think that's exactly what's going to happen. I'd love nothing more than for Jack Della Maddalena to come in here, put in a phenomenal performance, keep the fight standing, work his slick boxing, and just put on a real good, striking show against Belal Muhammad. I really like Jack Della Maddalena as a fighter, and he's one of these fighters that I do think is entertaining, that I do really like watching. So I'm rooting for Jack Della Maddalena to get the job done. But the reality is when it comes to, analysing the fight, I just don't see it. I think Belal Muhammad is just going to be, he's going to use his all-round game. He's going to be competitive on the feet. Even though I do think he would lose a striking fight, it doesn't mean he's not going to be competitive. I think Belal will be competitive on the feet, and he'll use that competitiveness striking to close the distance, level change, and start hitting takedowns on Della Maddalena. And even if he isn't getting those takedowns as often as he wants, or getting as much top control time as he wants, just sticking to him, pinning him to the cage, making this fight dirty, ugly, grinding, wearing down Della Maddalena, with his back against the cage wall. It's that type of fight that I also think Belal Muhammad could really suffocate him, and again, just get the job done. It's not going to be pretty, it's not going to be entertaining, I'm sure the crowd will be booing, but for Belal Muhammad, it does not matter. All that matters is that you retain that belt, you defend that belt, and get that belt wrapped around your waist at the end of the fight. And Belal Muhammad, with his superior fight IQ, with the ability to follow a game plan to a T, I just trust to get the job done. So for those reasons, I'm picking Belal Muhammad to win this fight and still the UFC welterweight champion. And in the next fight, our second title fight, we've got the Women's Flyweight Championship on the line. We've got Valentina Shevchenko versus Manon Fiorot. Now, I feel like for Manon Fiorot, this was just only a matter of time. The only time I was really sort of like betting against Manon Fiorot, it was more from a line perspective and the hype on the other side. I did bet Erin Blanchfield to beat her, and I genuinely think skill for skill, like Blanchfield, is a better fighter than Fiorot. I just feel the physicality of Fiorot played such a huge role in that fight, and it's going to play a huge role in this division because she's genuinely, from a physicality perspective, one of the bigger, stronger frames and bodies in this division. And I think that it's going to be very difficult for fighters to take her down because, look, she's, like I've just said with Della Maddalena, Manon Fiorot, predominantly a striker. She comes from more of a Muay Thai background though, but the wrestling and grappling is something that she will have been working on for years defensively to make sure she can keep fights on the feet where she's strongest. And I do think that she has made good developments there. You saw against Blanchfield, it wasn't all because, she's bigger and stronger. She had some good takedown defense and, she kept the fight where she needed to keep it. So she's clearly been working defensively on that wrestling and grappling, but the first line of that being that physical and that strong, it just makes it very difficult now for fighters to take her down. And I kind of feel that for Valentina Shevchenko, she's going to need to get this fight down to the mat to give herself the best chance of success. And it's a bit of a strange comment to make that, even as I'm saying it, because Shevchenko is predominantly a striker. That's where her background is, also on the Muay Thai scene as well, at a very high level. But I just feel that if she goes toe-to-toe with Manon Fiorot for 25 minutes, Fiorot's volume's too high. I think that the ability to sort of dictate the pace and the range of the fight is in her favour as well. I also feel that she's going to hit harder, so when both fighters are exchanging, I think Manon Fiorot will make Shevchenko feel the power more than the other way around, if that makes sense. So I think that for a 25-minute kickboxing fight, or a 25-minute Muay Thai fight, if you like, I think Manon Fiorot gets the job done. So for Shevchenko to win, I think she's got to mix in these takedowns. And to be fair to Shevchenko, this is something that she's done well. Like, she's got a high takedown accuracy per 15 minutes. She's hit 30 plus takedowns in her last X amount of fights. So, like, Shevchenko will lean on that wrestling, and she has historically always done a good job of taking her opponents down. Look at her last fight when she won the belt back against Alexa Grasso, plenty of takedowns, controlled. She dominated Alexa Grasso in that fight. So I think that, look, this is another thing as well. Like, when it comes to age, like, they're both very similar. I think Shevchenko's only 2 years older than Manon Fiorot, but where the difference is, I feel that Shevchenko's got a lot of miles on the clock, whereas Manon Fiorot's quite, sort of fresh in her career, even though, again, she's mid-30s. The miles on the clock plays a factor in this fight. I think Manon Fiorot is fighting like a fighter that's in a prime, even though you wouldn't expect a prime to be at 35. But again, the miles on the clock plays a factor. She has less miles on the clock, which means a prime is probably going to come a little bit later than, if she started fighting at like 17, 18 years old in MMA. So I feel like Fiorot's in a prime right now. I feel like Shevchenko, although she's just won the belt back, and credit to her for that, because, at one point she only had losses to Amanda Nunes, who's the greatest of all time women's MMA fighter, but then she loses to Alexa Grasso, and then she rematches Grasso and has the draw. Then she rematches her again for the trilogy and then dominates her. And credit to Shevchenko, because that doesn't happen in a lot of scenarios when fighters, especially at championship level, are rematching to get the belt back. So she went through that process. She lost to Alexa Grasso in a fight that she was winning, and then she drew, and then she dominated. So, look, what I'm getting at is, I don't think Shevchenko's a million miles away from a prime, but I don't think it's the Valentina Shevchenko that was the Shevchenko before the Tyler Santos fight, for example. So I think that when you're looking at this fight, I think that Manon Fiorot, even though they're both legitimately and predominantly strikers, I think Manon Fiorot will do a better job striking. I think more volume, hits harder, and I think Shevchenko might struggle to sort of get into range with the size of Fiorot as well. If she tries to clinch up and be physical, I think Fiorot's got the advantage there. For Shevchenko to win, I genuinely feel that she's got to hit plenty of takedowns here, and I'm just, after watching how Manon Fiorot dealt with Erin Blanchfield and the wrestling and the grappling that was coming away from Blanchfield, it gives me confidence that she's going to be able to deal with another fighter that needs to take her down in Shevchenko. So for those reasons, I'm picking Manon Fiorot to win this fight and become the new UFC Women's Flyweight Champion. And in the next fight, speak of the devil, and she will appear. We've got Alexa Grasso versus Natalia Silva. Now, Alexa Grasso, this is her first fight back from losing her belt, and it's going to be interesting from a mentality perspective of where she's at, because it's not as if she went in there and it was a close back and forth fight and she's lost a split decision and she put on a good performance and the judges just didn't see it her way. It wasn't that type of fight. She lost in a dominant fashion, and lost a belt as well. And it was that event in the Sphere with I think it was Noche UFC, so the whole Mexican heritage themed event. And yeah, I'm really intrigued to where Grasso's going to be at mentally, because it's not going to be easy to come back in and fight after that, because the other side to this is, I know Grasso's young enough to win the belt back, but while Shevchenko's still around, it does look like she's going to have issues beating her stylistically. And then if you put Grasso against a Manon Fiorot, I think that Manon Fiorot would also beat Grasso relatively comfortably. Again, they're both predominantly strikers, and I think Manon Fiorot is just going to be the better fighter. And then if we go one step further back, I think the next fighter that's in line after those two ladies I've just mentioned is Erin Blanchfield, and I think stylistically Erin Blanchfield absolutely has a way with Alexa Grasso as well. Now, again, Shevchenko is the older out of those three fighters, but still got a few years left, I believe, at the top level. Manon Fiorot, again, the miles on the clock that we've already mentioned, I think she's got years ahead of her. Erin Blanchfield's super young. She's got an entire career ahead of her. So for Alexa Grasso, coming back to Grasso here, I think that I'm just concerned of, how she's going to go, how motivated she's going to be in this fight, knowing that, that there's a lot stacked against her in how far she can go now in the UFC and the likelihood of her, winning that title back and having a reign as a champion. So, yeah, there's that side to it. But look, we've got a fight ahead of us. Natalia Silva has got her massive step up in competition here. This, for me, is the fight that will define Natalia Silva if she is to win. It will define where she's at and how far she's going to go. And for me personally, I think Natalia Silva is a potential future UFC champion. There's a couple of not stumbling blocks, but there's a couple of big hurdles in there. So again, as I've said, I think Manon Fiorot beat Shevchenko this weekend, so I'm basing this comment on that. And I think that Natalia Silva would have some issues with Manon Fiorot. I think that's a super competitive fight. I think an Erin Blanchfield fight would also be super competitive as well. And I even think, if Natalia Silva fought Shevchenko, there'd be a level of competitiveness in that as well. So I'm not saying Natalia Silva is absolutely going to be a UFC champion, but she's got everything that she needs to get there if she can make that happen. But like I say, she's got Alexa Grasso in front of her here. And I think it's a difficult fight for Grasso stylistically. Like, Grasso is a good boxer. That's where she's predominantly best. She can wrestle, she can grapple. She's definitely rounded out a game over the years. But Natalia Silva has legitimately been absolutely running through everybody she fought. I mean, she fought Jasmine Jasudavicius on a short notice UFC debut. And Jasudavicius, since that fight, has gone 6-1 in the UFC and is now very, very difficult to beat. We'll also talk about her a little bit later because she's got a fight on this card as well. But Silva absolutely is just tearing through everybody. She's stepping up in competition each fight. And yeah, look, I think that she's deserving of this spot against Grasso. Grasso typically does her best work against fighters that she can dictate the pace and the range, and she can decide when to move into range, when to move out of range, when to land her shots. And also she can mix in, sporadic takedowns and grappling as well in those fights where she's dictating sort of the other characteristics around the fight, apart from, the punching in the face type of thing. Like I say, the distance and the range and the pace. If she's dictating those things, that's when she will really have a way. And I think to an extent, she will have some of that in this fight, but I just don't think for long enough periods. Natalia Silva's not a fighter that's just going to sit on the back foot and allow Grasso to dictate the pace, range, the pace, range, and distance of the fight. I think Natalia Silva, if she does feel that the fight sort of had 30 to 60 seconds like that, she'll turn things up for herself. She'll push forward. She'll get in the face of her opponent. She'll be aggressive. And the thing is with Natalia Silva, I don't think she's got that many holes and weaknesses in a game. Like, she's a phenomenal striker. She can wrestle. She can grapple at a high level as well, but also defensively. So she can defend takedowns when she needs to. She can keep fights on the feet when she needs to. And I just think she's a little savage, is what I'm trying to get at. Like I say, she doesn't have too many holes and weaknesses in a game. So it's almost like, well, how is a fighter going to beat her? Well, a fighter's going to beat her when the opponent is just genuinely better in specific areas in MMA. So, for example, if Natalia Silva fought somebody that could defend her takedowns but was a better striker than her, then that's when she's going to get beat. She's not going to get beat because she's got holes and weaknesses in a game. I don't believe a fighter's just going to come in and take her down when they want, and then hold her down for as long as they want. And I don't think a fighter's going to, go toe to toe with her and just absolutely find holes in the striking defense and piece her and completely piece her up, drop her a few times because of it. I just don't see those elements happening. It's got to be an opponent that is legitimately just better than Natalia Silva, because again, finding holes and weaknesses is going to be very difficult on this girl. And I don't think Alexa Grasso is that fighter. I think that Natalia Silva is going to take the fight to Grasso. Although Grasso's a good striker, Natalia Silva's a different striker. She's a striker that will crash into the pocket, land punches land combinations in punches in exchanges, and then she can also mix in the wrestling and grappling, where I think that she's going to have advantages over Grasso there as well. So I just think that first and foremost for Grasso, to beat Silva, she's got to find holes and weaknesses in a game that I just don't believe she's going to be able to find, because I just don't think she's got those weaknesses in a game. And if she can't beat Silva, then she's going to get beat. And that's currently where I'm at with it. Like, I don't want to disrespect Grasso. She was a UFC champion. And like I said with Belal Muhammad earlier on, to become a UFC champion, you have to legitimately be one of the best fighters on planet Earth. It's just, I feel like Natalia Silva's surging. She's got unbelievable qualities from an offensive perspective everywhere. But more importantly, she's so tight in regards to defensively, and like I say, not showing any weaknesses and any holes in a game. So she's going to be super difficult to beat, and I'm not sure Grasso can get over that line and really take it to Silva without getting hurt and sort of be on the offensive in return. So for those reasons, I'm picking Natalia Silva to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Jose Aldo versus Aiemann Zahabi. Now, I suppose you couldn't have a pay-per-view without Jose Aldo on it, Mr. Pay-Per-View himself. And he's a fighter that, look, both of these fighters have got an element of surprise about them, because Aldo is seemingly still like at a super ridiculously high level when he's fighting outside of like the top 3 and 5. Like, I think being competitive with the very, very top of the division, it's going to be something at Aldo's current stage in his career that he's going to struggle with. But what he's doing at the minute, he's being this veteran that the UFC are putting fighters against to find out where they're at and if they're worthy of leapfrogging Aldo and going up into, the high ranks of the divisions. And look, the last fight where Aldo fought Bautista, I thought that was a horrific, decision. It was a fight that was close, like, granted, but I think Aldo won that fight, and he won that fight in a way that he's been winning a lot of his fights, a lot of his recent fights prior to that. And like I say, that's just being the stoic veteran that he is. He's an insanely good MMA boxer. That's something that, with his hands, that he's improved over the years. He once had this Muay Thai style with the hard leg kicks and the flying knees and the elbows, but it's the boxing that he seems to have fell in love with in the latter stages of his career. And the leg kicks are there from time to time, but they're not there as much as we want them to be. But man, the way that he can apply that Muay Thai, that slow Muay Thai pressure on his opponents, and then rip combinations, again, body, head, like super slick striking, but he's also really good defensively as well. So he's not getting hit that much. He's got a good head movement. He sees things coming really well. I think from a boxing perspective, it's crazy how good that he's got as an MMA boxer. Now, on the flip side, Aiemann Zahabi, super surprised with Zahabi as well, because he's a fighter that a lot of people wrote off a couple of years ago, myself included. I just didn't think that he was going to cut it in the UFC. But man, he's on a 5-fight win streak, and he's 37 years old as well. So if he was like 22, 23, and you're thinking, oh, okay, he's probably not going to cut it, but then fast forward 2 or 3 years and has developed rapidly and is now like 26, 27 and looking great, you're thinking, okay, well, he just needed that he was just very young to start with and just needed a bit of development and a bit of experience. But man, to do what he's done at 37 years old, it's definitely against all odds. And you've got to respect that, because it's not easy getting on a 5-fight win streak. It's not easy getting on a 5-fight win streak in the UFC, and it's certainly not easy to do at 37 years old when the majority of the MMA world has written you off and probably said that you're not gonna get to this sort of level, and is deserving of this fight against Jose Aldo. It's just, I think it's one of these fights where the UFC have matched to find out where Zahabi's at. Is Zahabi actually gonna, surge into the rankings, or is he gonna fall at the veteran hurdler that is Jose Aldo? And I kind of feel like he's gonna fall. I feel like Aldo is a fighter that's not going to get taken down by Zahabi. So, Aldo's got insanely good takedown defense, and if for whatever reason you take him down, he can spring right back up to his feet. Now, Zahabi's not necessarily a wrestler, but what it does is it takes out any potential second path to victory or plan B, or trying to mix things up that Zahabi is planning to do against Aldo. I think Zahabi's going to be forced into a striking fight here, and I just feel that Aldo's going to have too much for him. Like, Zahabi might have a power advantage. So, he does have these, every now and again, he will have these fights where he looks like he's got this deceptive power. But I don't know. I think if you're telling me pre-fight that Zahabi's going to knock Jose Aldo out cold, I just don't know. I don't see it. And I'm not saying it's not possible, because it's MMA. They wear 4-ounce gloves and they're at a high level. But I just don't see Zahabi knocking Jose Aldo out. I think it's more likely to be a 3-round war where they're both going at it, and in that type of fight, I think that Jose Aldo is just going to be better boxer, more volume, more efficiency on the strikes as well. I think when Zahabi comes in, I think Aldo's just going to work really well from a defensive perspective, slip the shots, fire back at him, counter to a point where Zahabi's thinking, right, well, I'm struggling to get at Aldo, and then Aldo starts applying that very slow Muay Thai pressure where he's coming forwards. Then suddenly Zahabi's back against the cage and Aldo's landing good strikes and good shots. So, yeah, I think that Jose Aldo is just a better fighter than Aiemann Zahabi right now. And if we are looking at wrestling and grappling, I think it's more likely that Aldo's going to be successful in a wrestling and grappling type of fight. If both fighters are going to try and mix things up in here, so strike, then shoot a takedown, I think Aldo's more likely to take Zahabi down and keep him down than the other way around. So maybe Aldo's got that second path to victory and that plan B and the fallback and the mixing things up in this fight if the striking's not working. But I do think the striking is going to work. It's just if it doesn't, I think Aldo could take this fight elsewhere. I think Aldo's just a better fighter. I think we're going to see a little bit of a levels type of fight. I don't think Aldo's anywhere close to being done, if I'm being honest. as long as he's fighting at around this level. Like, I don't think he can get to, that top 3, that top 5 anymore. But at this level, as sort of like a high-level, world-class gatekeeper type of role, I think he does really well, and I think he's going to do really well against Zahabi. So for those reasons, I'm picking Jose Aldo to win this fight. And in the next fight, this is an interesting one. We've got Brad Katona versus Bekzat Almakhan. Now, Almakhan was coming into the UFC, fighting Umar Nurmagomedov on his UFC debut, short notice. And I remember actually, in fact, I don't know how short notice it was, but I remember actually talking on the podcast of that event, and I compared that Almakhan and Umar Nurmagomedov fight to that of Arman Tsarukyan and Islam Makhachev. Like, a fighter that's coming into the UFC debut, struggling to get an opponent, both opponents struggling to get opponents, and then coming in and fighting probably the hardest available fight that the UFC could possibly throw at you. Like, go back to Tsarukyan. Nobody had really heard of Tsarukyan outside of the UFC. Comes in there, fights Makhachev on his UFC debut. Puts up a hell of a fight, by the way. First person to ever take Makhachev down in the UFC. Loses comfortably in regards to Makhachev edging each round comfortably. But man, the performance, like, there's only certain fights where your stock can rise that high with a loss. And the way that Tsarukyan fought against Makhachev allowed his stock to rise so much. And again, so much respect for Tsarukyan for taking that fight and fighting the way he did. And it turns out that Tsarukyan ends up being a world-class fighter that's at the top of the division. So I compared that to the Almakhan and Umar Nurmagomedov fight, because looking at Almakhan outside of the UFC, this dude's good. You can see he's legitimately good. Good striker, good wrestler, good grappler, good scrambles, good positional grappler as well. And he went in there, he dropped Umar Nurmagomedov as well. Like, you look at the stats, and the stats absolutely, like, floor Almakhan, like, massive strikes landed to strikes absorbed ratio, took down a couple of times as well. The stats, when you just look on paper, look horrific in that fight for Almakhan. But Almakhan actually put up a decent fight in that fight. Was it as good as Tsarukyan's performance against Makhachev? Probably not. But it's still a performance where Almakhan's stock rose in a fight where he lost. And I kind of feel that now Almakhan's got a huge step down in competition, and that's not discrediting or disrespectful to Brad Katona. It's just Brad Katona is not Umar Nurmagomedov. But with that being said, Brad Katona is actually quite a stoic fighter. One of these fighters that's very good everywhere. He's a very serviceable striker. He can wrestle, he can grapple, and he's got good cardio. He's good offensively and defensively. It's just the level on that skill set isn't at the top of the division. It's a good level for where he's at, and he's always going to be a difficult fighter to beat. But I feel like this is Almakhan's win in the UFC in this fight. He paid his dues fighting Umar Nurmagomedov for his UFC debut. Now he's got that step down in competition. But I think that although Katona will have good moments in that fight, because he has good moments in pretty much every fight, you can eventually get at Katona. Whether you're a pressure striker, eventually that pressure can break through. Whether you're a pressure wrestler, eventually that pressure can break through. And then the top side grappling as well. Katona will stand up a couple of times when he's forced to early in the fight. But if the takedowns keep coming, fighters tend to have just that little bit longer on top each time that they take him down. And I feel like this is where Almakhan's going to be good in this fight, because he applies pressure in all those areas. He'll apply pressure from a striking perspective, and if this fight is a 15-minute kickboxing fight, I think eventually Almakhan, that pressure does get at Katona, but I don't think this is going to be a 15-minute kickboxing fight. I think Almakhan's going to mix things up in each area and apply pressure in each area, and at some point all the pressures and the different disciplines in mixed martial arts is going to allow him to slowly edge the rounds and take over the fight. I think Katona starts this fight quite well until Almakhan sort of got a read on what's happening, how to approach Katona, because Katona's not an easy fighter to approach, and he's not a fighter that I don't think many fighters at this level can come into the fight early on and then just start putting it on him straight away, because Katona's also got a good level of fight IQ, reads the fights well. It's just, like I say, that skill set will take him so far, but I think Almakhan is just a better fighter at this stage in the careers. And I think Katona's going to start well. He's going to look like, okay, Katona's going to Katona's going to, put on not a surprising performance, but Katona's an underdog is going to start looking good. Katona probably shouldn't have been an underdog, but then the longer the fight goes on, I think the more Almakhan builds into the fight, gets takedowns, starts striking to crash the pocket to shoot those takedowns, then starts doing some good work topside grappling. And I just think Almakhan is, like I say, from an all-round mixed martial arts perspective, I just think he's a slightly better fighter than Katona right now. And as I've already said, I expect Katona to have some moments, but ultimately, I think that Almakhan gets this job done. So for those reasons, I'm picking Bekzat Almakhan to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Marc-Andre Barriault fighting at home versus Bruno Blindado Silva. Now, right at the start of the podcast, in the introduction, I mentioned a fight that's got a fighter that's on a 3-fight losing streak versus a fighter on a 4-fight losing streak. Well, this is that fight. Now, look, from an entertainment perspective, I absolutely think this fight is great. I think it's great matchmaking. Both fighters love to be stoic, to be tough, to come forwards, to be aggressive and try and knock their opponent out. Bruno Silva's got a level of wrestling and grappling, probably a little better than Barriault, or more likely to wrestle and grapple than Barriault, but for the most part, both fighters prefer to strike, like I say, be aggressive and knock their opponents out. It's just really interesting the fact that, like I say, we've got a pay-per-view fight, and on one side a fighter's on a 3-fight losing streak, the other's on a 4-fight losing streak. Not many fighters get another fight after they're on a 4-fight losing streak, so this fight is super crucial for both fighters, because I think if Marc-Andre Barriault was to have that 4th loss in a row against a fighter that's just lost 4 in a row, I struggle to think that Barriault would still be in the UFC. And on the flip side, if Bruno Silva loses 5 in a row, well, he's not Sam Alvey, so I would expect Bruno Silva to get his walking papers as well. And look, that's shit to say. I never like to see any fighter lose a job, but that's just the reality of how the UFC operates. Like I say, not many fighters get to 4-fight losing streak and get that 5th fight. So, like I say, it's definitely a crucial fight for both fighters. Does it play a factor? Is this going to be quite a tentative fight, knowing that both fighters have got to go out there and win? Well, I actually think with the current state in the UFC, with them putting a massive emphasis on fighters finishing fights, I kind of feel like both fighters are going to need to put the foot on the gas, because even with a decision win for either fighter, they could potentially be at risk. So I think that this is a fight where both fighters have got to bring it. And I just feel at home, Marc-Andre Barriault is going to be the fighter that's going to have that crowd behind him, that's going to be able to come forwards knowing that he's got the crowd and can use that energy from the crowd, get into Bruno Silva, clinch up with him, land some hard shots, because one thing that Barriault does so well, better than a lot of fighters in the UFC, is the short power that he can generate in the dirty boxing is insane. Like we've seen him stun fighters, knock fighters out with, that single collar tie, and then landing short uppercuts and short hooks in that clinch, and just being able to generate so much power and hurt them in those short areas. So I think for Barriault, that's definitely got to be, a factor in his game plan here, to close the distance, get a hold of Silva, clinch up with him, and then start landing those hard shots. I think at range, Bruno Silva's going to be the more dangerous fighter and the better striker. But like I say, it's going to be very difficult. I think it's going to be difficult for both fighters to fight consistently at the range that they want. Barriault wants to be all the way in. Bruno Silva wants to be all the way out / a little bit in for boxing range. So I think that, for Bruno Silva to have this fight and not to allow Barriault to close that distance all the way is going to be difficult. And for Barriault, he's got a job to do, because he's got to close the distance all the way in, and Bruno Silva's going to be the one that's, just got to prevent that from happening. But again, it's easier said than done. So it's a fight that I think you can tell by the way I'm breaking it down and the tone of my voice that I'm just not really that confident in, if I'm being honest, because I think Bruno Silva's the more, I wouldn't say washed, but he's the more declined fighter out of the two. Obviously, Barriault's not who he was, 5 or 6 years ago, but I definitely think that Bruno Silva's, durability is more of a question than Barriault's. I think is a little bit more declined than Barriault as well. So with that being said, Bruno Silva, the power's the last thing to go. He's super aggressive and he does have power, and I think that if he lands on Barriault, he can knock him out. So like I say, it's a tough fight to predict, but again, with a couple of points that I've mentioned there, in a fight where I do think both fighters have got legitimate paths to victory, and I wouldn't be shocked for either fighter to win or win by knockout, you got to look at the other slight areas around. Now, more often than not in a fight like this, I will take the underdog, just from a pure pick and prediction perspective. But like I say, this is a little bit different because I'm seeing, like I say, some slight durability issues on the side of Silva. I think he's declined a little bit more. I think he's showing age a little bit more. And I just feel that Barriault at home as well, there's not a great amount of upside, but there's some upside there on Barriault. And it's for that reason that I'm picking him to win. So for those reasons, I'm picking Marc-Andre Barriault to win this fight. And in the next fight, another hometown favourite, we've got Mike Malott versus Charles Radtke. Now, Mike Malott's a fighter where I think that we've just had to, put the brakes on a little bit, like he was surging in the UFC, super hyped. Then he had that fight against Neil Magny where he was absolutely smoking Magny and then just fell apart at the end of the fight. Like, really, really strange. You don't see many fights and fighters just, crumble that quickly in a fight where they've been absolutely looking outstanding. So from that fight, a bit of a reset, fights Trevin Giles. Trevin Giles is a fighter that, again, is very serviceable, but a fighter that's beatable for a surging prospect that the UFC believe are gonna make it to probably the top, not the top of the division, but in the high rankings. And Mike Malott goes in there, he beats Trevin Giles by decision, wasn't overly spectacular, but did what he needed to do to get back in the win streak, and I have to have a level of respect for that. Now, Charles Radtke on the other side is a fighter that I've never been overly high on. I definitely think he's got some good qualities, and I think Mike Malott has got to mind his P's and Q's in this fight because Radtke can wrestle, he can grapple, and he's got power on the feet as well. It's just, like I said with Brad Katona earlier on, he's one of these fighters that does have a good all-round skill set, but the skill set has limitations on the ability within that skill set, and I feel like Charles Radtke fits into that category as well. So like I say, for fighters in and around his own level, like he's gonna be very difficult to beat, but I think Mike Malott's not in and around that level. I think he's a step ahead, and I think that Charles Radtke's going to have problems because of that. However, with that being said, I do think that it's going to look very similar to the Trevin Giles type of fight, except again, you look at Charles Radtke versus Trevin Giles, if those two fought, I would expect Trevin Giles to probably win, a relatively comfortable decision in that fight, and Mike Malott's just won a somewhat comfortable decision against Trevin Giles. Now, MMA math is not something you should ever put too much stock into, but you can't ignore the fact that Mike Malott has just beaten a slightly better version of Charles Radtke, and now he's fighting a slightly lesser version of the fighter that he's just beaten in this fight. So it's hard not to expect Mike Malott not to win in this fight, but like I say, I think that Charles Radtke is going to be competitive at moments in this fight. Mike Malott's definitely got to mind his P's and Q's because Radtke has got an all-round skill set and will try and mix things up. But again, I think Mike Malott's the better fighter here. So for those reasons, I'm picking Mike Malott to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Jessica Andrade versus Jasmine Jasudavicius. Now, Jasudavicius is a fighter that we mentioned earlier on when we were talking about Natalia Silva. Natalia Silva, of course, her first UFC fight absolutely ran through Jasudavicius. But since then, two things. First one, as I mentioned in that Natalia Silva breakdown, Jasudavicius has gone 6-1 in the UFC since then, which is super impressive. That only loss was to Tracy Cortez, who's one of the best fighters in the division. So that's telling me that Jasudavicius is only losing fighters against fighters that are in the prime and A, surging in the division, and B, in and around the top of the division. So those are the fighters that Jasudavicius is losing against. But the other thing as well is, if you're going to take a loss, and you take a loss to a Natalia Silva, well, that loss has aged well, because Natalia Silva, we now know, beats everybody in the division. You go all the way back to that Jasudavicius and Silva fight. Nobody knew who Silva was. Jasudavicius was looking really good prior to Silva. Silva was like a plus 200 underdog, and at that point you're thinking, well, Jasudavicius probably isn't what we thought she was going to be, because she's just been smoked by this UFC debut woman who's plus 200 that nobody had really heard of before, and the regional scene didn't look overly great. So you're thinking, well, yeah, Jasudavicius isn't, she's not all that, getting beat by that type of fighter. But then look at what Natalia Silva's done since. Every single fight that loss that Jasudavicius took against has looked even better and better. So now you've got a fighter in Jasudavicius who's lost 2 fights in the UFC, one to Natalia Silva and one to Tracy Cortez. So, you can't say anything negative about Jasudavicius, because in every other fight she's absolutely dominating. She's looking really good. The striking's improving as well, but it's the physicality and the wrestling and the smothering where she does a really good job. And this is where I think Andrade is going to get done here, because Andrade is probably going to be the better, well, not probably, she is going to be the better striker. But again, there's decline on Andrade's side, so I don't think she's as fast and as nimble as what she once was. I think that she's definitely slowed down a little. The power's still obviously going to be there, and although she has stopping power and she's always had knockout power, it doesn't happen as much as what you would want it to. But with that being said, I don't think Andrade has declined enough. Like, I kind of feel this is a little bit like a Jose Aldo type of, fighter in Andrade and type of fight that the UFC have booked her, because I don't think Andrade is going to be competitive at the top of the division anymore. But she's now, I definitely think she could fill this world-class gatekeeper role. And this is Jasudavicius' time. She's took 2 losses against fighters that are above her. So let's see where she's at now. She's improved, she's developed, she's now on a win streak. If she can get past Andrade, then I think that shows the UFC that she's ready for that next level again, to have, another fight like a Natalia Silva, like a Tracy Cortez. I just feel that Andrade is going to do a good job striking here, which is going to force the wrestling and the grappling of Jasudavicius, and that's going to be the issue for Andrade. I think once Jasudavicius gets a hold of Andrade, I think she's going to be a little bit stronger, a little bit more physical. She's going to be able to find the takedowns, whether that's traditional wrestling using her wrestling background, or whether that's body lock trips and taking Andrade down. And once Jasudavicius is on top, she's very, very difficult to get back up from. And, opponents can get back up, but then Jasudavicius just goes back to the well again, and she just slowly breaks her opponents inside the cage. And I kind of think that that's what's going to happen here. I think Andrade, like I say, is going to be the better striker, but once Jasudavicius starts closing the distance effectively, getting the body locks, shooting takedowns or getting trips, I think Andrade is just going to have a long night then. And then the more that Jasudavicius does that, the more hesitant Andrade is going to be to strike, because she knows that if she gets too close or makes a mistake, then Jasudavicius is just going to take her down again. And I think it's going to be that type of fight. So for those reasons, I'm picking Jasudavicius to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Navajo Stirling versus Ivan Erslan. Now, this could be a real banger, to be honest. I feel like both fighters, though, they've had the UFC debut, so they've got that out the way. Obviously, Navajo Stirling won, Ivan Erslan lost, but the level of opponents were very, very different. Erslan was Iwan Cutelaba, who's been around the UFC for years, and also a fighter that's actually getting better as well. And we'll talk about Cutelaba in the next breakdown, because he's right after this one. But yeah, Ivan Erslan lost that fight to Iwan Cutelaba, whereas Stirling fought Tuco Tokos and got a decision win against him. And I actually think that both fighters, even though one won and one lost, I expected more from both of them. From Stirling's perspective, I would be expecting a fighter that's this explosive powerhouse, as a light heavyweight, to be knocking Tuco Tokos out. No disrespect to Tokos, I just thought that, look, Stirling's this hyped fighter, and I kind of feel that Tokos was an opponent that was given to Stirling for Stirling to shine against, if that makes sense. I don't think it ever truly plays out like that the UFC are okay, we're going to give this guy a loss. But, with the weight matched, I thought that it was a matchup that was favourable for Stirling. And then Ivan Erslan on the flip side, yeah, he was fighting Iwan Cutelaba, and Cutelaba's a really good fighter, but I think Erslan had some questionable moments in that fight where he probably could have done a better job and made that fight much closer and potentially even beat Cutelaba. I think Erslan and Cutelaba are still in and around the same level. It's just Cutelaba made that look easier than what it should have been, and I think Erslan had a hand in that. So I definitely think that, like I say, from Erslan's perspective, I expected a little bit more. I expected it to be more competitive. I actually bet Erslan as an underdog in that fight as well, and I expected him to win. I thought that was a good fight for him to get a win, even though it was a UFC debut, because he is super experienced, 14-4. So he's had almost 20 professional MMA fights. Whereas Stirling, on the other hand, I was disappointed with Stirling because I expected Stirling to have an explosive performance and knock Tokos out, and he didn't. It went to a 3-round decision. So both fighters are being matched here, and again, it's a real tricky one because of the first fights. Like, if Stirling isn't knocking out Tuco Tokos, then I don't think he's going to knock out Ivan Erslan, although you can never say never, especially at these heavier weight classes. But like I say, just going off Stirling not being able to finish Tokos, I think Ivan Erslan's a better fighter than Tokos, tougher than Tokos and tougher to beat as well. But on the flip side, like if Erslan is not taking the fight to Stirling, like, he could have took the fight to Cutelaba, then he's going to give Stirling opportunities to put volume together, rack up a decent amount of volume and land on him. And again, when you're getting landed on as a light heavyweight, the chances are, at some point you're going to get knocked out. So yeah, it's a real difficult one to call because, like I say, I feel both the UFC debuts were underwhelming for different reasons. But you look at Ivan Erslan, he's training with American Top Team, and look, I know Stirling's got the City Kickboxing guys who are an elite gym in New Zealand, but Ivan Erslan, I think, has got, I don't know, I think he's gonna be better prepared in this fight for his opponent. Like Stirling will be prepared to put on a striking clinic against Erslan, but if Erslan starts the wrestling and grappling, which is what American Top Team will be probably really be digging into from a game plan perspective, I'm just not sure at 6-0 Stirling's going to be ready for that level of wrestler and grappler. And with Erslan, he's 14-4. He's had triple the amount of experience that Stirling's had. I think at some point Stirling's going to face an opponent that he is going to fall short to because of that experience edge, because he's been around much longer, he's been fighting better level of competition in other big promotions as well. So I just think at some point the experience gap is going to find its way to producing the first loss for Stirling. Like Stirling's going to take that first loss, and it's going to be to a fighter like Ivan Erslan, who's well trained, well prepared, well rounded, and just has the experience edge. And I kind of feel this is going to be that fight where Stirling takes that first loss, learns from it, comes back stronger, and then potentially goes on a win streak. But again, like, yes, Stirling's exciting, he's an explosive, and he's got knockout power, but I just don't have that level of confidence just yet that he's going to go on this crazy long win streak at some point in the UFC and make his way right to the top of the division. I'm not saying he's not going to do that. I just need to see more from him to believe it. And I just haven't seen that yet. But like I say, the main point here is I think at some point Stirling's going to take that first loss, and it's going to be a first loss to a fighter that's super well-rounded, super well-prepared, come from a good team, and who's more experienced than him. And all those areas and attributes fit Ivan Erslan perfectly. So for those reasons, I'm going to pick Ivan Erslan to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Modestas Bukauskas versus Ion Cutelaba. So we touched upon Ion Cutelaba just then with Ivan Erslan. And look, Cutelaba's been a staple of this UFC light heavyweight division for a long time. He's not a fighter that I think will go on to become a champion, although, we've all had those, as MMA fans, we've all had those crazy predictions early in fighters' careers. Predictions that I think a lot of people would never want to admit publicly. But look, no one's right 100% of the time. 100% of the time in this sport, everyone has the moments when they're wrong, and I'm exactly in that same boat as everybody else. When Cutelaba first came to the UFC, and bear in mind we're going back years and years ago now, I looked at Cutelaba and I said that Cutelaba is a future champion, which again, like, I don't think he's been a million miles off, but actually, you don't need to be a million miles off. Like, becoming a UFC champion takes a special type of fighter, and Cutelaba just didn't have that. So yeah, that was a funny, crazy, wrong prediction that I've had. And look, from that perspective, by the way, if you've had a crazy prediction in MMA in the UFC, drop it in the comments on the YouTube channel. Let me have a laugh at that, because again, I've had more than that, by the way. And if we start to have a lot of people, commenting their crazy UFC predictions that would, that you can laugh at right now, I'll post a couple more as well for you. So yeah, look, we've all had those funny, crazy predictions. Drop them in the comments. Let's all have a laugh. No one's right 100% of the time. But look, coming back to this fight, I think that it's an interesting fight, and the betting line's really close as well, and I kind of get it. Like, Bukauskas is a fighter I've always liked quite a lot. He's a former Cage Warriors champion, two-time Cage Warriors champion. Obviously, after he got released from the UFC the first time, he went straight back and won it again. And Bukauskas is a fight. Look, anybody that's a Cage Warriors champion is always gonna, hold the weight in the UFC because, the battle tested over 5 rounds against a good level of opponents, built up the right way as well. So, yeah, Bukauskas is a fighter that I've liked a lot. Now, again, I don't think he's a fighter that is going to be one of these Cage Warriors champions that goes on to become a UFC champion, but he's definitely very serviceable and he's definitely good everywhere. He's a good striker, wrestler, grappler, offensively and defensively. And when Bukauskas loses fights, it's because he's fighting more often than not, it's because he's fighting someone that's not a specialist, but especially good in one specific area over Bukauskas. So what I mean by that is Bukauskas has got a good all-round game. But if he fights someone that's also got a good all-round game, but they're a better striker, then that fighter's the fighter that's likely going to win. Same with the wrestling and grappling. Now, with Ion Cutelaba, I think Cutelaba's got areas of his game that he is going to impose. And I think that Cutelaba's getting better wrestling and grappling as well. Like, he came to the UFC and all everyone spoke about was his Greco-Roman wrestling background, but you don't see it because he's this madman that loves to throw powerful strikes, wing bombs, knock his opponents out. But I feel like the older he gets and the more experience he gets in the UFC, the more he's like sort of honing himself to a game plan and developing in certain areas. Like, I don't think he's developing massively with his wrestling and grappling. I think he is definitely developing it a little bit, but it's more of a case of he's using it more. He's fighting more to a game plan and starting to fight to his strengths rather than going in there and just trying to knock his opponents out and be super exciting. And to be fair, he's still super exciting. You look at that last fight with Ibo Aslam. Super exciting fight that he ended up, getting the takedowns and getting the submission. And I think that Cutelaba, like I say, is starting to fight more to a game plan. I'm starting to trust him a little bit more as a fighter, because before it was hard to trust him because he was going to go in there, kill or be killed. And it's like, either kills his guy or gets killed himself. And it's like, you can't put a level of trust in that type of fighter that they're going to get the win. Sure, they might, but in a 50-50 coin toss fight where two light heavyweights have thrown the hardest punches that they can clean at each other's face, like, there's no way to be confident in that type of fighter. But now Cutelaba's starting to fight a little bit smarter, more to a game plan. He's bringing in his wrestling and grappling a little bit more than what he's done prior in his career. I'm starting to have a little bit more faith in him. And I think from an overall quality of fighter, skill set perspective, I do think that Cutelaba is a slightly better mixed martial artist than Bukauskas, so that's the way I'm leaning. It's just, if Cutelaba was still this crazy guy that was coming forwards and just trying to knock you out without putting any sort of thought, fight IQ or game plan into it, into the way he's fighting, I'd be leaning more on Bukauskas here. But because Cutelaba is starting to look really good, really improved, using some form of fight IQ and fighting to his strengths within a game plan, and I do believe is the slightly better fighter than Bukauskas, that, like I say, I have to lean towards Cutelaba here. So for those reasons, I'm picking Ion Cutelaba to win this fight. And the final fight to break down, we've got Daniel Santos versus Jung Yong Lee. Now, Daniel Santos took this fight on short notice. It was supposed to be Gavin Tucker versus Jung Yong Lee. Now, from Lee's perspective, I feel like he's got a much harder opponent here, but lucky for him, it is on more of a short notice. Now, Daniel Santos was supposed to fight not so long ago. He had to pull out with some medical issues from the weigh-ins or the weight cut or something along those sort of lines. So it's not as if he's come off the couch. He'll have had some form of fight camp, but he also did have some medical issues as well, which you can't ignore. Now, does that play a factor in this fight? Who knows? But from Lee's perspective, I definitely think he's got a harder opponent here than a Gavin Tucker. Like, Gavin Tucker's actually still a decent fighter, by the way. I just think that Daniel Santos is a little bit more dangerous, a little bit more explosive, younger, quicker. I think that Santos will pose different issues to Gavin Tucker, but I think that he's going to be harder to beat than a Gavin Tucker, is what I'm trying to say. So, look, Daniel Santos is a fighter that will come forwards with a ton of aggression, will look to land high volume, will eat a punch if it means landing one or two himself. He's got no problem with that. And then he's got a decent wrestling and grappling game. It's just with Santos, I'm just yet to be overly confident in him in the UFC. And what I mean by that is, you look at his UFC debut against Julio Arce, completely outmatched. Then he goes in there against John Castaneda, a fighter that, I've gone on record, I'm not massively high on John Castaneda. John Castaneda absolutely torched Daniel Santos in that first round before he gassed himself out trying to finish Santos and Santos not going anywhere. Like, credit to Santos, the durability and toughness of this guy is off the scale. But John Castaneda absolutely, like I say, torched him on the feet. And then Santos eventually came back in round 2 when Castaneda had nothing left. Then Daniel Santos goes in there, beats Johnny Munoz Jr. relatively comfortably. That's what we'd expect. Johnny Munoz Jr., I think, retired after that fight or got cut from the UFC, one of the two. But yeah, Daniel Santos, again, it's just one of them where I'm yet to see him win decisively against a real good level of opponent in the UFC. Now, Jung Yong Lee, I'm not saying is any better than a Castaneda, but he's tough. He comes forwards. He's gonna happily exchange with Daniel Santos. And again, I think he's going to test that Daniel Santos durability. I think he's going to chin check him. I think he's going to hurt Daniel Santos at some point as well. It's just, for me, does Daniel Santos fight smart? Because Jung Yong Lee does have some holes in his wrestling, and Daniel Santos can go to that. But I think if Jung Yong Lee comes forward and he wants to exchange in the pocket and land hard shots, I think Daniel Santos is going to oblige. I think he's going to be, okay, let's go. And, be the fun, entertaining fighter that he is. It's just that's going to give Lee opportunities to hit Santos, drop him, hurt him. And look, there's only going to be so many times that you get dropped once or twice in a round and hurt and being on wobbly legs that you actually get out of that round and come back. Like, more often than not, you don't. So if Jung Yong Lee ends up doing what Castaneda did against Daniel Santos, then you can't bank on the comeback every time, because at some point you are going to crumble. Like, that type of comeback that Daniel Santos had against Castaneda is relatively rare. And bear in mind, I had money on Daniel Santos in that fight as well. So, that's just me being honest. I think Jung Yong Lee can hurt Santos. He's a powerful hitter, crashes the pocket, good combinations, will exchange inside boxing range as well. And I think stylistically, that's a good way to get at Daniel Santos. Daniel Santos makes this fight closer and takes it away from Lee if he wrestles, though. That's my concern. But look, I'm torn on this, because like I say, I feel like Lee can get at Santos on the feet. It's just, does Santos fight smart and shoot for the takedowns? And I'm just not convinced, and I'm just not confident just yet. I need to see Daniel Santos fight against, be decisive against, a legit level of UFC competition a couple of times before I can start having some level of confidence in regards to what he's actually going to do. And I just haven't seen that quite yet, so that's why I'm a little bit unsure. So for the sake of the pick and prediction, I'm just going to side with the underdog here, which is the slight underdog in Lee. I'm picking Jung Yong Lee to win this fight. And that's all for this episode of the podcast. As always, thank you for tuning in. Thank you for listening. If you're on one of the podcast platforms like Spotify, Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, please feel free to come over to our YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/MMA Play 365. There you can leave a comment. You can tell me who you're betting on. You can tell me who we disagree with, who we agree with, how you think a certain fight is going to play out, who you want for a certain fighter to, if they win this fight. And of course, like I mentioned in the Cutelaba breakdown, if you've got a funny, crazy, wrong prediction that you made for a fighter, just like mine predicting Ion Cutelaba to become a UFC champion when he first came to the UFC, then please drop it into the comments. We can all have a good laugh. And yeah, I've got a couple more of them as well that I can drop if that happens as well. So yeah, all in all, thank you for tuning in. And of course, if you do end up on our YouTube channel, please hit the subscribe button. Really helps us, doesn't cost you a penny, and you get notifications as well when we drop the prediction podcast every single week. And one last time, if you're wanting to jump into the action this weekend, then make sure you do so at MMAplay365.com. Got something for every type of gambler on there. Everything's super affordable as well. It's just $5 for one event, $10 a month, or it's $99 for the entire year. Full of UFC, packed content from a prediction and betting perspective, professional handicapper advice, and then we've also got our AI prediction software, Base AI, giving a percentage prediction for every possible outcome of every UFC fight as well. We don't separate those packages. Everything's included for you in the betting subscriptions, and that's all at MMAplay365.com. I'm Newsome. Thanks for listening. I'll see you again next week.